I remember the sound before anything else. The sound of the rope creaking in the wind. It is a sound that never leaves you, no matter how much the years pile on. That day, as the stool was kicked from beneath my feet, I felt the whole town hold its breath, waiting, watching, judging. But none of them expected what would follow. Not the preacher clutching his Bible, not the sheriff with his rifle leaning heavy in his arms, not the women with their children pressed tight against their skirts. They thought it would end there, beneath the old oak tree at the edge of Red Hollow. They thought a noose and silence would bury me. They were wrong, because even before the sun set that day, thunder came riding across the plains. Not the thunder of the sky, but the thunder of hooves, hundreds of them, carrying with them the memory of what I had done, and what they had done to me. I was only 16, raised on the rules of the frontier like every other girl in Red Hollow. Speak when spoken to. Keep your dress clean. Obey the men who claim to know better. But I carried something with me that no rule could crush, the memory of my mother. She used to say, "Pain does not care about skin, hunger does not speak in language." I didn't fully understand those words as a child, but that winter, when the frost bit deeper than ever before, I finally did. Out beyond the ridge, where the land dipped into frozen rivers and wind-swept valleys, the Comanche camp lay in ruin. Mothers digging through dirt for roots, warriors too weak to stand, children coughing until their small bodies shook. I saw it with my own eyes, and once you see hunger written on a face, you cannot unsee it. The people of my town had a name for them: savages, thieves, heathens. Words meant to strip away humanity, words meant to make us feel righteous when we turned away. But when I looked at them, I didn't see monsters. I saw ribs pressing through skin. I saw eyes clouded with fever. I saw a reflection of myself if fate had placed me in their camp instead of the comfort of my father's hearth. That's when I made my choice. Quiet, simple, but dangerous all the same. I filled a burlap sack with food, cornbread still warm from the oven, dried beans from the pantry, apples I had hidden for winter, even the stew my father had left untouched. Before dawn broke, I slipped into the fog and walked toward their camp. Every step was a battle between fear and resolve. If anyone saw me, they would call it treason. They would call it betrayal. But hunger is louder than fear, and mercy is heavier than rules. When I reached the old riverbed, I thought I was alone. I thought no one watched as I left the sack near the camp's edge, heart hammering in my chest. I did not wait to see if they would take it. I simply left it and turned back, my hands trembling from the cold and from the knowledge of what I had done. But I was not unseen. High on the ridge, beyond the shadow of the mesquite trees, a pair of dark eyes followed me. Eyes that would change the course of everything. I didn't know then that one act of kindness would become the reason for my death. And I certainly didn't know it would become the reason 300 riders would one day thunder into Red Hollow, not for war, but for me. I should have known the fog would not hide me forever. Fog is a trick of the land, nothing more, and secrets are never safe in a place like Red Hollow. The town was built on whispers, and whispers grow teeth faster than wolves. By the time my boots touched our porch again, the morning frost still clinging to their leather, the sheriff was waiting. He leaned against the rail as though he had always belonged there, his hat pulled low, his hand resting lazy on the butt of his gun. But his eyes betrayed him. They carried something sharp, something hungry. "Where were you, girl?" he asked, though he already knew. Men like him never asked questions without knowing the answers first. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him I had gone walking by the creek, gathering wood, anything but the truth. But my hands betrayed me. They still smelled faintly of smoke and stew, of apples wrapped in cloth. He leaned closer and sniffed, then sneered, the word curling from his lips like venom. "Treason!" It spread from his mouth into the town faster than fire in dry grass. By sundown, every doorstep was alive with it. Treason. Betrayal. She fed the enemy. She helped the savages. I heard it in the voices of women I had grown up beside, in the stares of boys who had once thrown stones into the creek with me, in the silence of men who would not even look my way. No one asked me why. No one asked me what I had seen beyond the ridge. They had already decided what mattered, not the hunger of the Comanche, but the insult to Red Hollow's pride. That night, the town gathered. They always did when blood or punishment hung in the air. The chapel's bell rang 3 times, cold and sharp, and we all knew what it meant. I walked there with my father beside me, his hand firm on my arm, not in comfort but in control. His face was pale, lips pressed tight, as if he was ashamed of me more than afraid. Inside the chapel, the air smelled of sweat and wood smoke, and the preacher's voice carried like a hammer against stone. "She has betrayed her people," he thundered. "She has fed the enemies of God." No one asked me to speak. No one gave me the chance. My voice was a thing they had already buried. The vote was quick, almost careless, as though they were deciding on a fence to be mended or a trail to be cut. The result was the same as if the gallows had already been built. Guilty. That night, I did not sleep. I sat by the window of my room, watching frost grow on the glass, listening to the wind slide against the roof. I thought of the Comanche camp, of the children with hollow cheeks, of the mothers with eyes so tired they seemed already halfway to death. I thought of the sack of food, the cornbread that had still been warm when I left it. Did they eat it? Did it fill their bellies even for one night? Did they wonder who had left it for them? That thought was the only comfort I had left. At dawn, they came for me. I heard their boots before I saw their faces. My father opened the door, and I could not tell if the look in his eyes was sorrow or relief. They bound my hands with rough rope, tighter than necessary, as though I might run. But I did not run. Where would I go? The prairies stretched wide, but every path led back to the same truth. I was theirs to punish. They marched me through town as though I were a spectacle, as though my shame was a lesson they needed to teach their children. I saw faces I had known all my life twisted with something I had never seen before. Not hatred exactly, but fear. Fear that if they showed me kindness now, they might share my fate. Women clutched their little ones tighter, men spat into the dust as I passed, and the preacher walked ahead of us, Bible in hand, lips moving with words meant for God but spoken loud enough for all to hear. We reached the tree. It stood just beyond the chapel, gnarled and old, its branches bending like arms reaching down to take me. A noose already swung there, swaying gently in the wind, as though it had been waiting for me all along. I thought of the men it had held before, rustlers, raiders, thieves, but never a child, never one of their own daughters. Yet that morning, it made no difference. They tied the rope around my neck, rough hemp scratching my skin. The stool beneath my feet wobbled slightly, the cold seeping through my boots into my bones. I looked out at the faces, at the rows of familiar eyes staring back. Not one of them looked away. Not one stepped forward. Even my father stood with his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the ground as though by refusing to see me, he could pretend I was not his blood. The preacher raised his hand and spoke the words that would carry me into silence. Let this be a warning. The wind howled through the mesquite, and birds scattered from the branches. My heart thundered, louder than the murmurs of the crowd, louder than the creak of the rope. And then, without ceremony, the stool was kicked. The world tilted, the sky dropped, and I fell into the grip of the rope. For one endless moment, I was both weightless and unbearably heavy, caught between the earth that had betrayed me and the sky that would not claim me. And then, silence. They left me there, swinging gently, a body made into a lesson. But what none of them knew, not the sheriff with his sneer, not the preacher with his book, not even my father with his silence, was that someone had been watching. High on the ridge, behind the curtain of brush, eyes had seen everything. Eyes that carried my act of kindness in their memory like fire, and my death like a wound that could not heal. His name, though I did not know it then, was Tawny Fire Walker, and he would not forget me. I did not know his name while I was alive. I did not see his face when he first watched me leave that sack of food at the edge of the Comanche camp. But after my body swung lifeless from the town tree, after silence replaced my voice, his story became part of mine. He was the thread that pulled my memory into the hearts of 300 riders. His name was Tawny Fire Walker, a scout not yet old enough to carry the scars of many battles, but young enough to still believe in things like honor, mercy, and vengeance. He had been watching from the ridge that morning, hidden among the brush, when I carried the sack across the frozen earth. At first, he thought it must be a trick, some cruel gesture by the people of Red Hollow. A girl, alone, wandering into Comanche land with food? It made no sense. But as he studied my steps, the way I placed the sack with care rather than fear, the way I did not shout or mock or run, he felt something stir within him. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the spark of belief that kindness could come from where he had never expected it. And so, when he returned to the camp, he told no one what he had seen, not because he doubted, but because he feared they would laugh, or worse, that they would think him naive. The sack of food was found soon enough, and it was eaten that night, a blessing on empty stomachs. Mothers whispered prayers, children licked their fingers clean of stew, warriors chewed beans slowly, savoring every bite as if it were a treasure. No one knew who had left it, only that it came in the hour of their greatest hunger. Tawny remained silent. He held the memory close, like an ember cupped against the wind. Days passed. The sickness in the camp lingered. The winter showed no mercy. Yet the food gave strength enough for one more day, and sometimes one more day can be the difference between despair and survival. Tawny thought often of the girl, the pale hair, the trembling hands, the courage it must have taken to walk into danger with nothing but a burlap sack. He wondered if she knew how much it meant, if she could imagine the weight of gratitude resting on shoulders she had never seen. But gratitude turned to grief when he saw me again, not alive this time, but hanging limp from the town's tree. He had returned to the ridge out of curiosity, hoping perhaps to see me once more, hoping perhaps that kindness was not a fleeting miracle. Instead, he saw death. He saw the rope, the stool tipped in the dust, the faces of the townspeople staring with cold satisfaction. He saw me swaying gently, my hair catching the light of dawn, my body made into a warning. Tawny did not weep then. Warriors do not weep in the open. But his heart howled like a wounded animal. He turned his horse without a word and rode hard. For 2 days he did not sleep, pushing across frozen streams, through valleys carved by the wind, over hills that tore at his lungs. His fury kept him upright. His grief kept him moving. He rode to the stronghold of his people, where the great chief 10 Crowns had gathered what remained of the old clans, families not yet broken by war, warriors not yet taken by death, elders who remembered a time before their land was cut into pieces. When Tawny stumbled into the chief's tent, his legs shaking from exhaustion, the fire still burned in his eyes. He spoke of the girl, the white girl who had fed their children, who had walked unarmed into their land not with hatred but with mercy. He spoke of how the town repaid her, how they hanged her like an animal for no crime but compassion. His words cracked like dry wood in the flames, and for a moment the tent was silent. Warriors shifted uneasily. Elders frowned. Some shook their heads, unwilling to believe. A white girl, showing kindness? It was unheard of. But 10 crowns listened. He was old, his hair streaked with grey, his shoulders heavy with the weight of years. He had seen too much cruelty to waste breath on disbelief. When 20 finished, the young warrior's chest heaving, 10 crowns stood slowly, his eyes burning like coals. "Gather the riders," he said. The words spread like fire. Across the stronghold, men leapt to their horses, women readied spears, banners were unfurled. Drums sounded, deep and hollow, echoing through the night. By dawn, 300 riders were mounted and ready, faces painted with the colors of mourning, not of war. For this was not a raid. It was not a battle. It was something deeper, something no rifle or prayer could stop. 20 rode at the front, his hands still raw from gripping the reins, his heart still raw from what he had seen. Behind him, the war banners of 10 tribes cut through the wind, snapping like the voices of the dead. Together they thundered across the plains, 300 strong, a river of fury and grief flowing straight toward Red Hollow. The people of the town awoke to the sound. At first it was distant, a low rumble that shook window panes and rattled dishes. But as it grew louder, the truth spread quickly. This was no storm. This was no thunder. It was the hoofbeats of riders, dozens, hundreds, rolling toward them like judgment carried on the wind. By the time the sun rose high enough to paint the horizon in gold, the Comanche were upon the ridge overlooking Red Hollow. And the town knew, too late, that mercy never dies quietly. The sound came first. Always the sound. At dawn, Red Hollow stirred to life in the usual way, doors creaking open, smoke rising from chimneys, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing faintly against iron. But even as the town shook itself from sleep, another sound rose from the horizon, low and steady, like a drumbeat buried beneath the earth. At first, some thought it was thunder rolling across the plains. But thunder fades and breaks, while this sound only grew stronger, heavier, more certain. By the time mothers were pulling children indoors and men were running to grab their rifles, the truth had already reached their bones. Riders were coming. Not a handful, not a raiding party, but an army. 300 Comanche crested the northern ridge, their silhouettes black against the pale winter sun. Hooves churned the frozen ground into smoke, banners cut the sky with color, and the air itself seemed to tremble under the weight of so many. At their front was 20 Fire Walker, his face painted in streaks of grief, his eyes fixed on the heart of Red Hollow. Behind him, warriors sat tall, spears gleaming, braids whipping in the wind, every motion in unison as though they were one body, one heartbeat, one storm. Panic spread through the town like a fever. The sheriff barked orders, waving his rifle as though the steel in his hands could match the thunder on the ridge. The preacher stumbled into the chapel, clutching his Bible like a shield. Mothers gathered their children, pressing them into doorways, whispering frantic prayers. Men stood stiff in the street, rifles loaded but hands trembling, because they knew, every one of them knew, that if the Comanche charged, Red Hollow would not last a single hour. But the charge never came. 20 raised his hand, and the riders halted in a silence so sudden it cut sharper than any war cry. Dust hung in the air, horses snorted, banners fluttered, and then, slowly, 20 led them forward. Down the ridge they came, not with the wild fury of raiders, but with the solemn weight of a funeral procession. Their spears remained upright, their bows unstrung. No voices shouted, no drums beat, only the sound of hooves and the slow creak of leather as they descended into the heart of Red Hollow. The people of the town parted before them, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Eyes darted from doorways, shutters cracked open just wide enough to watch. And still, not a word was spoken. The riders made their way to the chapel, to the tree that stood just beyond it, the tree where my body still swayed lightly in the morning wind. 20 dismounted first. He walked alone, every step deliberate, his gaze fixed on me. The crowd held its breath, rifles lowered but not yet abandoned, their fear a living thing pressing against their ribs. Twenty reached the tree, his hand brushing against the rough bark, his jaw tight with fury and sorrow. Then, without hesitation, he drew his knife. The crowd tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. But the blade did not turn on them. Instead, Twenty lifted it to the rope. One stroke, and I fell into his arms. The gasp that rose from Red Hollow was louder than gunfire. To see a Comanche warrior cradle the body of a white girl, not with rage but with tenderness, was something their minds could not hold. He lifted me carefully, as though I were not broken, as though I were something sacred. My hair fell across his arm, my face pale against the red paint of his chest. For a moment, time stopped. The only sound was the wind threading through the branches. Then Twenty turned. His voice carried not as a shout, but as a cry thick with grief. "You hung the only white soul brave enough to show mercy," he said. "We will not burn your homes. We will not spill your blood. But know this, from this day forward, we see you, and we remember." The words struck harder than any arrow. Silence crushed the town. The sheriff lowered his rifle. The preacher's lips stopped moving. Men looked at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of the riders. Shame spread faster than fear, but it was a shame too heavy to speak aloud. Twenty mounted his horse once more, my body held close against him. Then he turned, and with a signal, the 300 riders wheeled as one. They thundered out of Red Hollow in a storm of dust, their banners snapping in the wind, their hooves pounding the earth like a drumbeat of memory. When the dust finally settled, the town was left in silence. Doors creaked open again, faces emerged, but no one spoke. The tree stood bare now, its rope swinging like a ghost in the morning light. The people of Red Hollow had expected death, destruction, fire. What they received instead was far worse. A mirror, a reflection of their cruelty, carried away in the arms of those they called enemies. That afternoon, the townsfolk gathered in the chapel once more. But there were no jeers this time, no votes cast, no voices raised. Only silence. The preacher knelt before the altar and wept. The sheriff resigned, his badge tossed onto the floor like a coin no longer worth its shine. An old woman, her hands trembling, placed a wooden cross at the base of the tree. But it was too late. Mercy had been buried, and the ghost of it would linger over Red Hollow for generations. The dust had barely settled when Red Hollow began to rot from the inside, not in the way a fire consumes, sudden and violent, but in the way a sickness spreads, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore. The Comanche had left without firing a shot, without burning a single home, without spilling a drop of blood. But their silence was sharper than war, and their absence heavier than any grave. In the days that followed, no one spoke of what had happened. Not in the open, not around tables, not even in whispers. The memory of 300 riders cutting across the horizon lingered like a storm cloud no prayer could chase away. The sheriff, once so proud with his badge gleaming on his chest, packed it away in a drawer and never wore it again. He walked through town like a ghost, his hat pulled low, avoiding the eyes of those who once cheered his authority. The preacher, who had shouted the loudest at my trial, could not bear to stand at the pulpit. On Sundays, he wept instead of preaching, his hands trembling as though the Bible itself had turned to ash in his grasp. Children, once full of laughter, now walked past the chapel in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground. Some of them had seen me hanging from the tree. Some of them had seen Twenty cut me down. And though their parents tried to shield them with lies or prayers, children remember in ways adults cannot undo. They carried the image in their sleep, in the hush of their play, in the way they turned away from the old oak tree whenever the wind made the rope creak. But perhaps the heaviest burden fell on my father. He said little after that day. He worked his land with the silence of a man who no longer believed in soil or harvest. Neighbors said they saw him wander to the edge of the chapel yard at dusk, staring at the tree until the light was gone. He never placed a flower, never carved a marker, never spoke my name again. But silence itself can be a confession, and his silence was louder than all the words shouted the day they condemned me. Time in Red Hollow did not heal. It only deepened the wound. The mines that once brought men with silver in their pockets began to dry up. Wagons rolled out of town, families leaving with more shame than belongings. Those who stayed found themselves living in a place that felt thinner, emptier, haunted not by ghosts they could see, but by the weight of memory pressing against every corner. The town dances stopped. The chapel bells rang less often, and whenever the wind carried a sound like hooves across the plains, men tightened their grips on rifles, hearts leaping as though the riders might return at any moment. Seasons turned, and still the shadow of the tree remained. Winter brought frost that clung to its bark. Spring wrapped its branches in blossoms that seemed more like a mockery than a blessing. Summer's heat made the rope creak and sway, and autumn stripped it bare again, revealing the scar where Twanny's blade had cut me free. It was in the first spring after my death that the flowers appeared. No one saw them placed, but one morning, when the sun broke across the prairie and the dew still clung to the grass, townsfolk noticed a small bundle of wildflowers resting at the base of the tree. Bluebonnets, their color sharp against the dirt, tied with a strip of leather. Some whispered that it must have been a child, sneaking out with trembling hands to ease a guilty conscience. Others swore it could only be the work of an old woman, someone too close to death herself to fear judgment. No one knew, and no one confessed. But the flowers kept coming, every spring, without fail. Fresh, delicate, unexplainable. The preacher called it a curse, a reminder sent by God to punish Red Hollow for its wickedness. The sheriff claimed it was a trick, perhaps even left by Comanche scouts in the night to keep the town fearful. My father said nothing, but neighbors noticed he lingered longer at the chapel yard in those days, his eyes fixed not on the tree but on the flowers. He never touched them. He never moved them. But when the wind lifted the petals, some swore they saw his shoulders tremble. Over the years, the legend of the flowers began to spread. Travelers passing through would hear the whispers, would see the blossoms with their own eyes, and they would carry the story farther down the trails. Some said it was the spirit of the girl herself, returning each spring to remind the town of what they had done. Others said it was the Comanche, keeping watch in their own way, honoring the one white soul who had dared to show them mercy. And some claimed it was both, that mercy and vengeance had braided together in the wind, forever tied to that place. Red Hollow shrank year by year. The mines were gone, the shops shuttered, the laughter of children faded like smoke. But the tree stood. The rope frayed, the wood aged, yet the branches held their vigil. And beneath them, the flowers always bloomed, as faithful as the sunrise, as certain as shame. What the town never understood, what they could never bury, was that kindness echoes longer than cruelty. They thought the rope would silence me, that the noose would erase me. Instead, it was the rope that marked them, the tree that remembered, and the flowers that refused to let them forget. Years have a way of stripping towns bare, the same way wind strips the prairie of its grass. Red Hollow did not collapse in a single moment. It withered slowly, piece by piece, as though time itself had chosen to punish it. What the rope began, silence finished. Families moved away first. Those who could not bear the shame-packed wagons under cover of night, slipping down the road with no farewells. They left behind empty houses with windows staring blankly at the street. The mines followed soon after. Where men once dug silver from the hills, now only shadows gathered, and the sound of pickaxes faded into memory. The saloon closed its doors, its piano silenced, its windows clouded with dust. By the time a decade had passed, Red Hollow was no longer a place of promise, but a place of whispers. And always, there was the tree. Every spring, without fail, flowers appeared at its roots. Sometimes wildflowers, sometimes sunflowers, once even roses, their petals already wilting from a long journey. No one ever saw who left them. No footsteps marked the dirt. No figure was caught wandering at dawn. Yet the blossoms came, year after year, as faithful as breath. Children who grew up in Red Hollow began to whisper stories of a girl who returned with the seasons, barefoot and pale, carrying a sack of food in her hands. They said if you listened in the stillness of morning, you could hear the faint creak of a rope, followed by the sound of hooves in the distance, fading as quickly as they came. Travelers carried these stories farther than the people of the town ever could. The tale of the hanged girl became something passed from campfire to campfire, drifting across the plains like smoke. Some told it as a warning of what happens when mercy is met with cruelty. Others told it as a ghost story of a girl who refused to rest, her spirit bound to the oak that ended her life. And still others spoke of it as a kind of prayer, proof that even in the harshest places, kindness could take root and refuse to die. By the second decade, Red Hollow was a shell of itself. The chapel stood, but its bell rang no more. The schoolhouse gathered dust, its chalkboards empty, its benches warped by rain. The sheriff's office leaned crooked on its foundation, the badge inside left to tarnish until it was no longer gold but grey. Even the preacher's voice fell silent at last, his sermons replaced by coughing that carried him to the grave. His headstone sat crooked in the yard behind the chapel, but no one tended it. No one dared, because all attention, all fear, all reverence, belonged to the tree. Travelers began to visit not for trade, not for the mines, but to see the place where it had happened. They came with hushed voices, their eyes fixed on the rope that still dangled like a scar against the bark. Some carved words into the wood of the chapel, prayers or apologies or curses, as though writing them they would keep the memory at bay. Others left offerings, trinkets, coins, scraps of food, beside the flowers at the tree's base. But most left quickly, spooked by the weight of the air, by the silence that seemed heavier than stone. They said the land itself carried the memory. Horses balked at passing too near the tree. Dogs whined when dragged into the chapel yard. Even the wind seemed to change there, slowing, thickening, carrying with it the faint sound of creaking wood. Farmers who lingered too long swore they saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the ridge, hair shining in the moonlight, eyes wide with something that was not fear but quiet strength. By the third decade, Red Hollow was a ghost town. Only a handful of families remained, too stubborn or too poor to leave. The rest was silence and ruin. The saloon's windows shattered, the mines filled with water, the houses leaned inward as though ashamed of themselves. The chapel's cross rotted, falling to the dirt with no hands to raise it again. But the tree endured. The tree thrived even, its branches stretching higher each year, its roots digging deeper, as though it fed on the memory of what had happened beneath it. And still, the flowers came. Some said it was Tawny himself, grown old but unwilling to forget. Others said it was the spirits of the Comanche, returning each spring to honor the girl who had shown them mercy. And some whispered that it was me, not as a ghost chained by anger, but as a soul who refused to let the earth forget what kindness looked like. Whoever it was, whatever force guided the blossoms to bloom, the truth was clear. Red Hollow could not escape. It became a place of shame, of legend, of warning. A town once carved into the prairie by men's pride became nothing more than a hushed story told by travelers around fires. And in every telling, one thing remained the same. The girl was not forgotten. Kindness echoes longer than cruelty, and mine echoed louder with every passing year. The rope had not silenced me. The noose had not buried me. The tree had become my monument, the flowers my voice, and the silence of Red Hollow my eternal sermon. I used to think memory faded like smoke, drifting thinner until the sky swallowed it whole. But Red Hollow proved me wrong. Decades passed, yet the story clung tighter with every year, as though the town itself refused to let go of me. By then, few people still called Red Hollow home. The last families who remained lived in houses that sagged with age, roofs patched with tin, porches cracked like old bones. They spoke little, as if conversation itself might summon the past, and avoided the chapel yard altogether. No one walked near the tree unless forced, and even then, they kept their eyes fixed to the ground. The shame of the rope was heavier than any sermon, and silence had become their only prayer. But strangers came. Strangers always came. Some were drifters following the trail west. Some were treasure seekers, hoping the mines still held silver. Others were storytellers, eager to see with their own eyes the place they had heard of in whispered campfire tales. And all of them, no matter how bold, ended up standing before the tree. They never stayed long. A few minutes, maybe an hour, and then they'd leave with faces pale and jaws tight, as though the air itself had pressed too heavy on their lungs. One spring morning, when the sun was still pale and the grass wet with dew, another stranger came. At first glance, he was like any other, tall, lean from travel, his horse weary beneath him. But there was something in the way he dismounted, slow and deliberate, his hand brushing the trunk of the tree as though he already knew it. He did not tremble. He did not avert his eyes. He stood before the rope and the blossoms with the stillness of someone who had been waiting a lifetime. His hair was long, streaked with grey. His skin was weathered by wind and years, and his braid was tied with leather worn smooth by touch. His eyes, though, were sharp, dark with a memory that time had not stolen. He knelt at the base of the tree and stayed there for hours, unmoving, his hand pressed against the earth where the flowers grew. The town's few remaining souls watched from behind windows and doorways, whispering guesses, but none dared step closer. They did not need to. The truth was clear enough. When at last he rose, the years in his shoulders seemed heavier, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I am the one who saw her." That was all. The words were not shouted. They were not even offered to the townsfolk, but to the wind, as if he knew it would carry them farther than any ear could. He closed his eyes then, whispering words in his own tongue, words no one else could understand. Some swore it was a prayer. Others said it was a vow. But all who heard knew it carried weight, as though the earth itself listened. I knew his face, though age had changed it. He had been young once, hidden on the ridge the morning they tied my hands. His eyes had been bright with shock, with fury, with disbelief, as he watched a girl choose kindness and be repaid with a noose. Twanny Fire Walker, that was his name. The one who rode for 2 days without sleep to bring news to his people. The one who carried grief back to his chief, sparking a storm of riders that thundered to Red Hollow's edge. He had not forgotten. Not then, not ever. The townsfolk whispered that day, wondering why he had returned. Some feared vengeance, that he had come to stir up the ashes of war. But no vengeance came. He did not raise a weapon. He did not curse. He only stood, touching the rope gently as though it were a wound, and left behind a single feather tied with red thread at the tree's root. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, his figure shrinking into the horizon until it was swallowed by the prairie. But his presence lingered. It clung to the air like smoke after a fire. The people who had hidden in their homes said that when he spoke, the town itself seemed to still, as if the earth had held its breath to listen. They said the birds did not sing until he left, and the wind carried his whisper long after his horse vanished. It was then that the legend deepened. The children of the few families who remained grew up with a new piece of the story. Not only had the girl been remembered by flowers and silence, but by the return of the warrior who bore witness. They said he came not as a ghost, not as a rider in a storm, but as a man bound by a promise, that as long as he lived, someone would remember. And for a moment, I wondered if perhaps I was not alone, that even in death, even bound to the silence of a tree, I was carried in the heart of another who had seen what no one else dared believe. Red Hollow could ignore me. They could abandon the chapel, let their streets rot, bury their shame in silence. But Twanny had returned, and his whisper still rode the wind. I had become more than a story. I had become a vow. And vows, unlike towns, do not crumble with time. The years after Twanny's return carved deep cracks into Red Hollow's bones. It was not sudden, not the way lightning splits a tree in half, but slow, steady, and merciless, the way winter gnaws at a cabin until even its nails rust loose. Families drifted away one by one, always at night, always without farewell. Wagons rolled down the main street with curtains drawn tight, and by morning another window was boarded shut, another hearth gone cold. It wasn't the mines alone that drained the town, though the veins of silver and copper had dried up long ago. It wasn't even the endless droughts that baked the earth into dust. No, what drove people away was something quieter, heavier, something no one dared name aloud. Shame is not seen, yet it weighs more than stone, and Red Hollow carried more than it could bear. The tree became the heart of it. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how far they stayed from its roots, the people could not look at it without feeling the rope at their own throats. 4 years, some had tried to decorate it with ribbons, hoping to disguise its shadow with color. Others nailed crosses into its trunk, pleading for forgiveness from a guard who had remained silent that morning. But the wood spat the nails back, splitting them with rot, and the ribbons frayed to nothing in the wind. Nothing clung to that tree but memory, and memory did not loosen its grip. Travelers still passed through, trappers, soldiers, men chasing the frontier's last whispers of fortune, but none stayed. Word spread from campfire to campfire, from saloon to saloon. Red Hollow was cursed. They said no cattle thrived there. No crops lasted more than a season. They said the chapel bell cracked itself one winter without a hand ever touching it. And they said that at dawn, if you stood near the tree, you would hear a sound too soft to be wind, too heavy to be bird wings. The creak of a rope under weight. I cannot say whether it was truth or invention, because I knew what I heard, what I felt. My body may have been taken down, but my presence lingered like smoke that refuses to clear. I had no choice but to remain. I was not vengeance. I was not fury. I was memory. And memory is the sharpest blade of all. Children whispered of me first. They claimed they saw me barefoot in the grass, carrying a sack heavy with food, my eyes fixed on something beyond the ridge. Some swore they heard me walk the main street at night, the dust stirring though no figure passed. At first, the adults hushed them, calling it imagination. But then grown men began hearing it too. The sound of footsteps across the porch after midnight. A voice carried faintly on the wind, soft but clear enough to prick the skin. Some said they caught sight of me in reflections, in the water trough, in a cracked mirror, standing silent, watching. And so Red Hollow began to hollow itself. Doors stayed locked. Curtains stayed drawn. The laughter of children disappeared, swallowed by fear of shadows that carried my name. The preacher tried, once, to lift the curse. He stood before the tree in the last summer before he left, Bible trembling in his hands, sweat glistening on his brow. He shouted verses, begged heaven to break whatever spirit clung to the earth. The people gathered, hopeful, desperate. But as he prayed, the wind rose, the branches swayed, and the rope, which had long since rotted away, gave a single chilling groan. The sound silenced him, silenced them all. By sundown, the preacher packed his books and fled without looking back. What none of them understood was simple. I was never there to harm them. I did not thirst for revenge, nor did I hunger for blood. I was there because they could not erase me. They could bury their guilt beneath layers of silence. They could abandon their homes, let weeds swallow their gardens, let coyotes roam the streets. But they could not erase the choice I had made, to see hunger, to see pain, and to answer it with kindness, even when kindness demanded the highest price. The prairie itself seemed to remember. Each spring, flowers still bloomed at the tree's roots. No hand planted them, no one claimed the act, but year after year, wild blossoms appeared, bright as fire against the dust. Travelers noticed. They asked who tended them, but the townsfolk had no answer. And in truth, some began to fear it was not flowers at all, but a sign that the earth itself honored me, that nature had chosen to cradle the memory the people wanted to forget. By the time the railroad bypassed Red Hollow, there were fewer than 30 souls left. The saloon closed its doors. The blacksmith left his forge to rust. Only the chapel remained open, though its pews were empty most Sundays. Those who stayed lived in houses stripped of joy, bound not by hope but by a strange duty, as though leaving would make them complicit in erasing what happened. They endured, but they did not live. And I endured with them. At night, when the wind crept through the hollow streets, I walked among the houses. I saw faces pressed to glass, their eyes wide, their lips trembling as though they wanted to speak but dared not. And in those moments, I almost pitied them. For while I had been bound once by a rope, they were bound forever by silence. The tree stood as judge, jury, and reminder. Red Hollow was dying, but the memory of me was only growing stronger. And soon, it would outlive them all. It did not happen all at once. Red Hollow did not vanish overnight, as some ghost stories like to tell. No, it faded slowly, like a candle left to burn itself to smoke. First the laughter left, then the voices, then the very rhythm of footsteps that once filled its streets. And in their place came silence, the kind that did not comfort, but accused. I remember the last winter before the town broke. Snow fell hard that year, blanketing the rooftops, pressing against the windows. Inside the homes, families sat without speaking, afraid of the howling wind outside, afraid of the whispers they claimed to hear within. The sheriff's old house still stood at the end of the street, but his badge had long been surrendered, left rusting in the chapel's empty pew. He had left quietly one morning, riding west, never to be seen again. The preacher followed months later, carrying only his Bible and his shame. One by one, the others slipped away. A mother clutching her children, loading the wagon with what little bread she had left. A miner, shoulders bent under the weight of failure, muttering that there was nothing left worth digging for. Even the blacksmith, whose hammer once rang like a heartbeat through the hollow, left his anvil cold and covered in frost. By the time spring came, the town was no more than a skeleton. Houses leaned against one another like weary men, their paint peeling, their windows clouded with dust. The saloon doors swung with the wind, never with the push of a hand. The chapel bell, cracked and useless, swayed without sound. And then there was the tree. Always the tree. Its branches still clawed at the sky, its roots deep and stubborn, unbothered by the abandonment around it. No matter how far people fled, no matter how many wagons rolled into the horizon, the memory tied to that tree clung like ivy to stone. Some said the prairie itself had chosen it as a monument. Others swore it was cursed, that the soil beneath it would never forgive. But I knew the truth. It was not cursed. It was a witness. I lingered there most often, not because I wanted to, but because memory bound me as surely as the rope once had. I could not walk far from Red Hollow. I could not follow those who left. My place was there, where compassion had been punished and cruelty had worn a mask of law. That was the ground that held my story, and so that was where I remained. Yet, as the people vanished, I began to notice something strange. My presence grew stronger, not weaker. When the town was alive, I had been a shadow at its edges, a flicker in a mirror, a whisper carried by the wind. But when the last lamps dimmed, when the streets emptied and the chapel's doors stayed closed, I found myself everywhere. The sound of my footsteps echoed without pause. The sack I once carried felt heavy in my arms again, though it was no longer bread or beans but something else, something unseen, something eternal. I no longer appeared only at dawn or dusk. I lingered in the broad light of day, my figure drifting across the street, my bare feet pressing into the dirt, though no mark remained behind. And people still came, even when Red Hollow was nothing more than a rumor. Travelers on horseback, wanderers with packs on their shoulders, men chasing the horizon. They came because they had heard whispers, that in the heart of the prairie stood a tree that remembered. Some came with curiosity, expecting to find only an old trunk and the ruins of a mining town. But when they reached the ridge, when the dust cleared and the town lay hollow before them, their faces changed. They felt it. The silence was too heavy, the air too thick with something unnamed. And when they walked near the tree, most did not linger long. I remember one man, a soldier, uniform torn, eyes sharp from years of blood. He stood beneath the branches, scoffing at the tales, calling them foolishness. But as he turned to leave, his body froze. His hand reached for his throat as though he felt a rope there, pulling tight. His knees buckled, his face turned pale, and he stumbled away with terror in his eyes. He never returned. Others came with reverence. A woman once laid down flowers at the roots, whispering a prayer. A young boy placed a carved wooden doll there, his lips trembling as though he spoke to someone unseen. Some came seeking forgiveness for things they had done elsewhere, as if the tree itself had become an altar for the guilty. And though I never answered, though no voice left my lips, they always walked away changed, carrying with them the weight of my silence. The Comanche, too, remembered. Years passed, decades even, but every so often a rider would appear on the horizon. He would not enter the town, would not cross its empty streets. Instead, he would ride straight to the tree, dismount, and sit in silence for hours. Sometimes they left offerings, a feather, a beaded bracelet, a small pouch of dried herbs. They never explained, never stayed long. But their presence was enough to remind the wind that I was not forgotten. And so Red Hollow fell into ruin, but its story grew larger than its walls. It spread across the prairie like fire on dry grass. Some told it as a warning, that cruelty would always come back to haunt the cruel. Others told it as a lesson, that compassion could not be erased, not even by death. And some told it as a ghost tale, of a barefoot girl who still walked at dawn, carrying food for the starving, her figure fading into the morning mist. I became many things to many people. A spirit, a curse, a warning, a legend. But to me, I was only one thing, a girl who made a choice. And because of that choice, Red Hollow became a graveyard not of bodies, but of memory. The town was gone. The people scattered. The buildings collapsed. Yet still, each spring, flowers bloomed beneath the tree. No hand touched them, no seed was sown, but they came without fail, defiantly bright against the dust. And every time they did, I felt something stir. Not sorrow, not regret, but a quiet reminder. Kindness cannot die. It echoes, long after the world tries to bury it. And in Red Hollow, it echoed louder with every year that passed. Years blurred into decades, and Red Hollow's bones were swallowed by dust and weeds. The roofs collapsed, the saloon doors rotted from their hinges, and the chapel bell fell silent forever. Yet even as the town itself disappeared, my presence did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger, carried on the lips of strangers who had never set foot near the prairie. The story spread far beyond Texas. Cowboys whispered it on lonely trails, passing it from one campfire to the next. Railroad men told it as they laid tracks under the scorching sun, swearing they heard a girl's footsteps on the gravel behind them, though no one was there. Mothers repeated it to children as a warning, their voices low and trembling. Never turn away the hungry, never shame the kind, lest Red Hollow's spirit follow you home. I was no longer Samantha in their telling. I was the girl beneath the tree, the barefoot bride, the hanging saint. Each name twisted the truth and reshaped it, but each carried the same heartbeat. Kindness had been punished, and the earth itself had refused to forget. Travelers who braved the ruins claimed to see me more clearly than ever. Some said I walked the ridge at dawn, the rising sun bleeding through me like smoke. Others swore they heard me singing to the wind, a wordless hymn that froze the marrow in their bones. A few, only a few, said they saw my face, and it was not sorrow they found there, but something harder to bear, forgiveness. That was what unsettled them most. For vengeance, people can understand. But forgiveness, that lingers like fire in the conscience. The Comanche, too, kept their watch. Generations passed, and still their riders returned, leaving offerings beneath the tree. Some said they came not for me, but for the lesson I carried, a reminder of how the earth marks cruelty and remembers mercy. Whatever their reason, their presence gave the place a weight no time could erase. And so Red Hollow became not a town, not even a ruin, but a story etched into the fabric of the West. Travelers sought it out the way pilgrims seek shrines, half hoping to see the ghost, half dreading what they might feel if they did. And always, the flowers bloomed. Each spring, without fail, blossoms rose at the foot of the tree, vivid, untouchable, as though the soil itself whispered my name. No drought killed them, no storm swept them away. They endured, and so did I. Time no longer mattered in Red Hollow. The wind carried years like leaves across the prairie, but I remained. I was not a ghost bound by anger, nor a spirit demanding vengeance. I was memory itself, stitched into the soil, the tree, and the air, waiting for anyone willing to see what had been done and what had been undone. Travelers still came, though rarely. They arrived at dawn, when the sun's first light gilded the skeletal ruins of the town, and they felt it immediately, the weight of what had happened here. Some saw a girl standing barefoot beneath the tree, sack in hand, eyes wide with quiet strength. Others heard the faint creak of a rope and the distant thunder of hooves across the hills. And some, the bravest or perhaps the most cursed, swore they saw both at once. A girl alive with compassion and an army in mourning riding in the wind, faces painted, banners snapping in the sunlight, returning one last time to honor a life taken too soon. The tree itself became a monument beyond explanation. Its branches stretched toward the heavens, as if holding the sky up for those who had failed to do so themselves. The flowers at its roots continued to bloom, untouched by time or hand, each spring a silent sermon on mercy. People left offerings there, coins, carved feathers, trinkets of memory. Some whispered apologies. Some whispered prayers. All left changed. I was no longer bound by death or by the rope that had taken me. In my presence, people felt the weight of kindness, the echo of compassion that cannot be erased. It outlives cruelty, it outlives fear, it outlives towns that crumble into dust. And Red Hollow, though abandoned and broken, had become eternal because of it. The Comanche who had once ridden for 2 days to honor me did not return in body, but their memory, their respect, carried on in every flower, every whisper, every story told around campfires across the prairie. They had taught me once that mercy is louder than vengeance. And even after centuries, that lesson rang truer than ever. Visitors leave the ruins of Red Hollow, but I do not leave them. They carry me with them, a shadow in their footsteps, a quiet strength in their hearts. And when the wind rises and the birds begin to sing across the hollow, I am there, watching, remembering, forgiving. Kindness cannot be silenced. Mercy cannot be forgotten. The rope may break, the town may die, the lives may pass, but the echo of what I did, of what was done to me, will ride forever on the wind. Samantha Whitmore is not just a memory. She is the wind itself, the flowers beneath the tree, the quiet strength that survives hatred. She is a reminder that even in the harshest places, even in the coldest hearts, one act of compassion can outlast everything. And so Red Hollow sleeps, empty of people, but alive with the truth I left behind. I am here, always, and I will not be forgotten.